He was 11 when they took him. His name was erased. His body mutilated. And his life no longer his. They gave him silk. They gave him food. And then they took everything else. He didn't scream, not once. Because silence, in palaces like these, was more valuable than gold. In the heart of the imperial city, past 7 layers of lacquered gates and 47 pavilions scented with amber, was a room no one spoke of. It had no name, no inscription. Just a single emblem carved above the entrance, a serpent coiled around a rose. Inside, silence didn't just reign, it devoured. Children were not supposed to be born there. At least, not children like him. In the annals of the inner court, only one kind of child had the right to cry, to breathe, to be held by a wet nurse wrapped in linen from the southern provinces. The child of the emperor. And no other. But the palace was a place where rules were embroidered onto banners, while exceptions were carved into flesh. In a different world, a baby born in gold-leafed rooms might be cause for celebration. Here, it was a liability, a threat, a stain. The child of a concubine conceived without permission, born without blessing, was not considered a person. Not a bastard. Not even an error. He was an infection. And like all infections, it had to be purged. Midwives were trained not in care, but in erasure. They carried needles sharper than their tongues, cloth soaked not in milk, but in vinegar, and hands that moved quickly before a single scream could reach the paper-thin walls of the jade pavilion. One midwife, long ago, wrote a letter to her sister in the outer provinces. It never reached its destination, but the parchment was found decades later, stuffed behind a loose tile in her chamber wall. "We are not killers," she wrote, "but the ones who keep the lie alive. Because if the lie dies, the throne bleeds." She hanged herself a week later. It was not always like this. Centuries earlier, imperial offspring, even illegitimate ones, were seen as signs of virility, proof of divine favor. But then came a famine, a coup, and a whisper in the emperor's ear, "Too many seeds in the soil, and nothing will grow." From then on, the doctrine was clear. Only one seed matters. Only one tree shall rise. All others must rot before they bloom. And so, they rewrote the laws of birth. Every new child had to be registered within hours. Every concubine was monitored by 3 levels of eunuchs. Every bed was inspected. Every breath counted. And still, they were born. In secret. In shame. In fear. Some were smothered within moments. Some drowned in ritual basins meant for holy washing. Others quietly vanished. But one did not. He was born on a night so quiet, even the guards spoke in gestures. His Mathera 5th-rank concubine with almond-shaped scars on her thighs gave birth under the table of a retired seamstress. He did not cry. He opened his eyes, dark as polished jet, and stared straight at the lantern above, as if he already knew where he was. They called him Thread, because he was too thin to be anything else. And also, because he would be woven into something larger than himself. He survived for 3 years. Hidden. Fed with leftovers stolen from the wet nurse of the emperor's youngest daughter. But palace secrets rot faster than meat. One morning, the eunuchs came. Smiling. They always smiled. They took the boy without protest. His mother was made to watch. The execution was not recorded. But his name was, briefly, written on a small scroll in ink that fades under candlelight. Thread, male, age 3. Non-authorized birth. Outcome, dissolved. Dissolved. Like fat in broth. Like memory in wine. It wasn't personal. Nothing ever was. The throne did not hate him. The emperor did not know him. The palace did not remember him. But it remembered what he represented. And in a world built on illusions, nothing was more dangerous than an unwanted truth with a heartbeat. He was no longer a son. No longer a boy. He became something else. The palace was a cage. But unlike most cages, this one gleamed. Gold leaf curled along its edges. Silk draped its bars, and those inside were expected to smile. There were many types of people within the inner court. There were concubines, eunuchs, servants. But the most carefully watched were the children. In the middle years of the Phoenix dynasty, a time not often mentioned in the outer provinces, children born in the palace were considered pollutants. The emperor's line was sacred, his seed divine. To allow any other bloodline to grow was treason in flesh. And so, they devised a system. Each birth was recorded, each womb was counted, and every child inspected. But not all children were drowned. Not all were silenced. A rare few were spared, not because they were special, but because they were beautiful. They were boys, always boys. Selected before they could walk, evaluated for skin tone, teeth symmetry, and the clarity of their crying voice. A perfect cry meant strong lungs. Strong lungs meant vocal beauty. Vocal beauty meant performance potential. These children were not trained in swordplay. They were not groomed for courtly politics. Instead, they were shaped like clay. Boys with the wrong posture were beaten into silence. Boys who wept too long were removed. Boys who asked questions were never seen again. And those who remained became ornaments. The palace had a term for them. Pearls. Not sons, not servants. Just pearls. They were bathed in rice water twice daily, fed duck, tongue, and lotus seed paste. Their hair combed backwards, always away from the eyes, to widen the gaze. And once they reached the age of 7, they were taken. Not killed, not exiled, but taken into the chamber of quiet winds. There, a physician waited, with no rank, no name, just gloves. The procedure was swift. A cut, a clamp, a stitch. No anesthesia. Pain was part of the discipline. Afterward, they were not boys. They were not men. They were something else. From that day onward, the pearls no longer played. They learned to walk without sound, to laugh without teeth, to breathe without being noticed. Their purpose was simple: to serve. Not food, not tea, but presence, mood, aesthetic. They were kept in rooms lit only by moonlight, trained in poetry, dance, eye contact, and how to say yes in 33 ways without ever using the word. One such pearl, known only as Ash, lasted longer than most. He entered the palace at age 5. By 8, he was the favorite of Lady Min, 4th consort to the emperor. By 10, he had memorized every verse of the Book of Gentle Servants. By 11, he was summoned to the emperor's bedchamber. No records remain of what happened that night. Only that Ash did not return to the Pearl Quarters, and Lady Min was demoted 2 ranks. When a servant girl asked where Ash had gone, she was told, "He became a mirror." No one asked again. In the golden age of palace aesthetics, there were no rites, only rituals. And children, if not born royal, became part of those rituals. Or they were removed. Ash was not the first, and he would not be the last. The palace did not kill out of cruelty. It killed out of precision. And when it spared a child, it did so with a purpose more chilling than death. To erase is simple. To reshape takes patience. He was no longer a child. He was no longer alive, in the way we understand life. He had become a design. He was no longer a son. He was no longer a voice. He was a mirror, reflecting everything but himself. He was no longer a son. He was no longer a voice. He was a mirror, reflecting everything but himself. Mirrors in the palace were polished daily, not because they needed cleaning, but because the reflections they offered were never true. Children like him, those who were spared, altered, shaped, they existed in the blur between flesh and function. Alive, but not living. Breathing, but without pulse. They were bodies without context. Emotions without outlet. Wounds without witnesses. Outside, historians still argue whether these children were victims or servants. whether the system was cruel or simply efficient. Inside, no one debated, because debate requires voice, and their voices had been trained into softness, then into stillness, then into nothing. Ash, now called Silk Breath, served at the eastern end of the Plum Blossom Pavilion. He no longer blinked in surprise. He no longer dreamed. But he remembered how to listen. And sometimes, when the Empress passed through the hall with her rustling entourage, he would feel something. Not longing, not pain, just a static, like fabric rubbing against skin too long. Something forgotten, brushing the edges of his skull. What no one spoke aloud was this: the ones who died were the lucky ones. They did not learn the art of being furniture. They did not survive long enough to know how to smile with their eyes but not their mouth, how to hold a teacup like it might break the empire, how to disappear while standing perfectly still. Ash had learned. He had learned too well. Sometimes he saw his reflection in lacquered floors or water basins and thought, "That is not me." But if not, where did I go? The palace claimed it had rules. And it did. They were sharp, precise, ritualized. But beneath those rules was something older, darker, a hunger to erase what could not be controlled. Children with no names, boys without futures, servants bred to serve, but not to exist. It's easy to condemn the past, to call them monsters, to ask, how could they? But the palace was not made of monsters. It was made of silence. And silence has always been the most obedient servant of power. Sometimes, when the guards laughed too loudly, Ash would flinch. He didn't know why. Just that noise joy felt unfamiliar. There are wounds that leave no scars, because the flesh was never cut. Only the soul. He was 15 when they stopped calling him by name. Not because they forgot, but because names were for people, and he was something else. It would be easy to say that he died inside. But death implies an ending. There was no end. Just the slow, methodical evaporation of identity. Like perfume in an open jar, left too long in a locked room. One morning, a servant spilled tea beside him. Ash didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. The tea burned through the silk and into his leg. He didn't notice. A physician later said, the body was intact, the mind had rearranged itself. We speak of empires like they were made of soldiers and kings. But empires were built on backs like his. Not rulers, not warriors, but mirrors, bent just enough to reflect power without ever showing its cracks. And in the end, when Ash was dismissed, not killed, just dismissed, no one asked where he went. He was not exiled, not retired, just gone. No grave, no plaque, no name, just the soft echo of footsteps in a corridor that hadn't been cleaned in years, and a mirror, slightly cracked, still hanging in the eastern hall. Some disappear in screams, others vanish by standing still too long. He wasn't beautiful, not pale enough, not delicate, not poetic, but he lived. No one noticed at first. He was born during a plague outbreak, a week when even the Empress wore masks, and eunuchs wiped down silver plates twice before serving. The court physician missed the birth. The registrar was ill. The bloodstained sheets were buried before sunrise. And so, the child remained. Not hidden, just overlooked. He was not a pearl, not trained, not prepared, just alive. By the time anyone noticed, he was already too old to erase quietly, too unknown to claim officially. They gave him a temporary name, Page, because he was blank, a sheet no one had written on. Yet, he crawled through the underside of pavilions. He napped on coiled carpets discarded from failed royal weddings. He listened through thin rice paper walls as women wept over miscarriages no one would name. The palace didn't know what to do with him. He didn't belong to any rank. He wasn't sanctioned. He wasn't supposed to be here. But killing him now would be complicated. Too many had seen. Too few cared. And worst of all, he had begun to speak. They tried to place him among the animal keepers, but he startled the falcons. They tried to place him in the kitchens, but he asked too many questions. Why can't I wear shoes? Why do the other boys wear gold and I wear rope? Why does everyone call me it? No one answered, because no one had been ordered to. By the time he was 5, Paige had learned 3 things. Silence gets food, questions get pain, and names are dangerous. One night, an old eunuch found him asleep in the corridor near the baths. He wrapped the boy in a moth-eaten robe and whispered, "You weren't meant to be here. That's why you're still here." The boy didn't understand. He never saw the eunuch again. He grew quickly, not strong but alert. Too alert. By age 7, he had memorized the daily path of each concubine, the cough patterns of every physician, and the exact time the guards fell asleep between midnight shifts. But none of that mattered, because he still had no place. He was not useful. He was not loved. He was not hated. He simply existed. And in a place like this, existence without function was a threat. Eventually, the ministers noticed. Not because of him, but because of a misplaced scroll. His name was on it, in the margins, scribbled by a scribe who had since died. The order came in folded silk. Paige, source unclear. No placement. No use. Resolve. But by then, Paige had vanished. Not escaped. Not fled. Just disappeared. Some say he walked into the emperor's study one night, looked the old man in the eye, and whispered, "I remember what you forget." No one could confirm it, because no one ever saw him again. No death. No exile. No echo. Just the lingering idea that somewhere, in a corridor too quiet for memory, a child not meant to live still listened. He had no name, but in the end, it was memory that feared him. They weren't murdered. They weren't buried. They were simply forgotten. No gravestone. No record. Not even a whisper behind closed fans. And in the palace, forgetting was a form of governance. The empire didn't need blood to silence. It needed only time. And silence. And silk-thin excuses. Some of the children spared by mistake, like Paige, simply faded from the daily rosters. First from duties, then from names, then from memory. There were no funerals, because there were no deaths. Just vanishings. Slow, soft, seamless vanishings. The palace had a phrase, still breathing, but not existing. They were given no food, but not denied it. No punishment, but not safety. They lived between moments, not in them. In old texts recovered from a ruined archive, one anonymous servant wrote, "Some children rot like fruit. Others, dry like herbs brittle, colorless, weightless." He had cared for one, a boy he only called Third Shadow, the third child, to follow him silently for months, and then simply disappear. He didn't remember the boy's face, only that he never made noise when walking on marble. They say memory is an act of kindness, but in the court, memory was a liability. To remember one of them was to become responsible, and so everyone learned to forget. Even the children themselves, some of them tried to leave. They weren't stopped, because to stop them would be to acknowledge them, and acknowledgement meant failure. So they wandered into attics, into abandoned bathing rooms, into disused towers, where spiders were the only witnesses. One was found, weeks later, sitting in the emperor's garden, watching koi fish eat petals. When asked his name, he said, "The fish remember more than I do. They did not rebel. They did not scream. They did not write memoirs. They did not dream. They were ghosts. Before their deaths, ghosts made of protocol, of unfinished meals, of half-remembered verses from lullabies no one ever sang. One palace teacher once wrote a poem. It was only found centuries later behind a false panel in the Library of Rituals. There are no graves. There are no bones. Just empty rooms, with the shape of children still clinging to air. Perhaps the palace wanted it this way. Perhaps forgetting was mercy. Or maybe it was a way to ensure no empire would ever be held accountable for those it erased without knives. They did not die. They were not killed. They simply stopped being seen. His name was never spoken, but his face was printed on porcelain fans, lacquer panels, even embroidery along courtly robes. He was not royalty. He was not ordained, but he was chosen. The empire needed a new myth. Too many whispers. Too many missing children. Too many corridors too empty for their size. And so, they gave the people something to believe in. A living mercy. A miracle child. Proof that the emperor was kind. That some children born in the palace were spared. He was chosen before he could speak. Selected for his symmetry. His docile gaze. His bone structure. He wasn't loved. He was displayed. He lived not in a room, but in a viewing chamber filled with silk cushions, gold-trimmed screens, and two-way mirrors. Foreign dignitaries were brought to see him. Priests bowed. Poets composed verses in his honor. He was not permitted to talk, because mercy, in the court, was supposed to be graceful, not noisy. The scribes called him the lantern child, because he was always lit, always visible, but never warm. He was taught to smile without emotion, to stand without swaying, to exist in pauses. And the palace applauded its mercy. They wrote songs about him. They commissioned a mural, Kindness in Flesh. It showed the boy kneeling at the emperor's feet, a dove perched on his shoulder. The real boy had never seen a dove, and the emperor had never touched him. One day, a foreign princess asked to speak to him. The court refused. They said he did not speak her language. That was a lie. He had learned 6 dialects in secret. Alone, in silence, at night, when no one else was watching, he whispered forgotten words to cracked tiles and sleeping moths. Sometimes he stared at the embroidered dove on the mural and wondered, was the bird real? Was he? He grew, and that became a problem, because the court needed a boy, not a man, not a question, just a boy, eternal, silent, untouched. So they painted newer murals, with a younger face. They sang the same songs, with gentler chords. And one morning, he was gone. No one spoke of it. There was no scandal, no disgrace. Just a new version of the same lie. A new mercy child. A younger one, more camera-ready, more pliable. And the old one? He was placed in the records pavilion. To copy texts. To stay quiet. A servant asked him once, "Do you miss being sacred?" He answered, "I was never sacred. I was proof." He still lived there. Some said he died at 83. Others claimed he wrote the secret histories under a pseudonym. No one knew for sure, because no one wanted to know. He was mercy made flesh. And mercy is always easier to believe. When it disappears just before it becomes too human, no rebellion ever came. No one broke down the gates. No scroll was leaked. No name was screamed into the throne hall. And yet, the palace began to remember. It started with the tiles. Some of them loosened not from age, but from something underneath. When lifted, they revealed fragments. Tiny cloths. Hair. A carved wooden rattle never recorded in inventories. The servants didn't speak of it. They nodded, reburied it. But they looked over their shoulders more often now. And at night, they left hallway candles burning longer than protocol allowed. Then came the murmurs. Not voices, not language, just presence. A weight behind the air. A silence that felt observed. The Empress's dog refused to enter the northern corridor. The floor beneath the western courtyard remained warm, even when snow piled 2 feet high outside. A visiting scholar woke up weeping. having dreamed of a boy with no mouth, kneeling beside a scroll, written in blood that never dried, in the pavilion of eternal harmony, the mural of the lantern child began to fade. Not crack, not peel, but fade, as if the wall was forgetting what it had once pretended to celebrate. A new mural was proposed, but the painter declined. When asked why, he simply said, "It would be like painting over a grave. Those who remembered began to die, not all at once, but softly, conveniently." The old eunuch who once whispered to Page, found lifeless in the herbal cellar. No marks, no wounds, only a trace of silk tied gently around his wrist. The archivist who kept the index of forgotten names collapsed at his desk. When his drawers were searched, there was nothing inside, just a faint outline in dust, where a scroll had once rested. And yet, some names returned, not spoken aloud, but scribbled in corners, etched in dirt on a window, muttered by children in their sleep, children who were never taught to fear the halls. They began to draw them, figures with no eyes, no mouths, hands bound behind their backs, but always standing upright. The palace called it imagination. The tutors called it nonsense. But the walls knew better. No one revolted. No throne was toppled. No proclamation was made. But the truth did not die. It simply waited for the silence to thin, for memory to shift, for cracks to grow wide enough, for names to crawl back through. They were not saints. They were not demons. They were children, smothered by tradition, erased by ceremony, swallowed by silk. But nothing truly disappears. In a place where every stone is carved to remember, and every mirror was once a witness, the palace still stands. But beneath its gold, 1,000 names press against the stone, not screaming, not angry, just waiting, because memory, even buried, learns how to breathe.